Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my analysis into national security affairs. Let me show you the book. The Oxford Handbook to National Security Intelligence. This is the book that I'll be using. The first video in the series links to purchasing the book. I would definitely recommend that you purchase the book, and if you want to, reference how I'm interpreting or challenge my interpretation of the reading, by all means get the book. Again, the lecture series is nothing more than an attempt to give a different perspective, my own unique interpretation of the readings, but it's just that, it's just my interpretation. In terms of the text, make sure that if you want to get the notes, you just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. I've recently updated the notes, so get the most revised version of the notes. Today we're going to be on page 5, section 1.1. We're going through a deconstruction of the phases of the intelligence cycle in a little bit more detail than I did in my previous National Security Affairs video series. So let's begin on page 5 with section 1.1. So this is National Security Affairs and Intelligence, again, and this is the book. Okay, and this is section 1.1. Alright, so stage 2 of the intelligence cycle is collection. In the previous section, we talked about planning and direction. And the idea in terms of planning and direction is our planning phase is going to be heavily influenced by a recognition of two main things, for the most part. Information, raw intelligence, raw information that we gather in terms of within the within the intelligence community, threat assessments, but also it's going to be sort of the intelligence needs that policymakers have. So the combination of intelligence needs on the one hand and threat assessments on the other is primarily going to drive the way in which the intelligence community plans the function of, systemically, the function of the community, right? And we do recognize that there's individual parts and components and such within the community, but generally it's threat assessment internally and the intelligence needs sort of externally that are going to structure the way in which the community as a whole functions in terms of planning. So stage 2 now is collection. Author says, quote, this is the most expensive phase, right? This is the most expensive phase in the intelligence cycle. The most expensive phase. Obviously, this is the most expensive phase, right? If we're talking about human intelligence, well, you have to pay people to go to different locations to collect information. Especially when we're talking about satellite and when we talk about, you just think about a satellite, right? The satellite's orbiting the Earth, gathering information. That's not a cheap thing to maintain. It's not a cheap thing to put up into orbit. It's not a cheap thing to fix. I imagine they break. It's not a cheap thing to code for. It's not a cheap thing to pay the people who code for those things, right? It's very, very expensive, right? So collecting the information is tremendously expensive, right? So in stage 2, collection, the most expensive, and I'm not going to get into which aspect is the most expensive, because for my purposes here, that doesn't really matter. But just know that, and this is not me, the author says, and it makes sense, that this phase is the most expensive. So let's look at open source intelligence. I'm not going to, do I go through all of the, I don't go through all of the different forms. No, I don't go through all of the different forms. To look at one form, open source intelligence, it is information gleaned from non-secretive origins, such as libraries, the internet, media. Some say as much as 95%, right, in terms of OSINT, right? which is open source intelligence, right? Open source intelligence. 95% of all intelligence reports are comprised of open source intelligence, right? This is a direct quote, right? 95%. 95% of all intelligence reports, 95% of all intelligence reports are comprised of open source intelligence. Okay, so why did I bring this up? First, I bring up the idea that the collection phase is the most expensive phase. The next thing is a recognition that open source intelligence comprises 95% of all intelligence reports. Well, the idea then is, are we really spending all of that money on information that is readily available? And the answer is yes and no. I'm not going to go into sort of a systemic breakdown of this because obviously the information we gain from satellites is, in a sense, you could argue, some have, that it's open source, but we're talking about immediate stuff, conversations with the people, stuff that's published on the internet, a blog that you have, and such. 95% of all of the intelligence reports are comprised of open source. The question obviously becomes, and I'm not going to answer this question, it's rhetorical, the question obviously becomes, are we spending that much money on information that's readily available? That's the question, right? Again, there's no need to answer it. The question is, are we spending that? Which means that there would need to be research done internally to assess, and I'm sure there's research done internally to assess every penny, how that money is being spent. But in terms of taxpayers, I mean, it would seem to warrant a justification why a lot of money is being spent, if it's being spent on information that's readily available, right? It wouldn't make sense to say, oh yeah, we have this huge budget, but 95% of all the information that we get from browsing the internet. And I don't mean to make this trite, right? I know that people in the intelligence community aren't spending their days surfing Facebook. I would imagine that there's some need for that, but I would imagine people are doing real intelligence work. Not to say that that's not real intelligence work, but the idea is, if the report that's being compiled, 95% of it is from open source intelligence, well, okay, we need to understand why this becomes the most expensive phase. And as I said, I already know why, right? It's because of all the technology and the maintenance of the technology that's in place. All right, so the distinction between HUMINT and TechInt, the combination of machine-based intelligence collection activities, this is a direct quote, right? The combination of machine-based intelligence collection activities, the vast majority of monies spent on collection goes to TechInt, which is exactly what I was saying, right? It's the machinery, it's the programming, it's the coding, it's the engineers, it's the maintenance that requires and absorbs as much money as it does. Less money appropriated HUMINT because, meaning human intelligence, right? Less money is appropriated in HUMINT because, in comparison to TechInt, the yield is comparatively meager, the amount of information. Now, I just wanted to qualify this point, but let me finish the sentence. Yield is comparatively meager, that is the amount of information collected within this phase. We do need to recognize, and again, I'm lecturing on this subject as a civilian, but we do need to recognize, only, not necessarily to say that I disagree with the author. It's not that I disagree with the author, but it isn't just about the sheer quantity of information. I think later I talk about how much intelligence isn't used, or how much intelligence is collected, just sits dormant, because it's so much. It's an overwhelming amount of information. It's information saturation. Granted, we need intelligence, we need information, so there's a sense no information really is ever wasted, but you can be oversaturated with information. Despite the fact that there's a huge quantity of information that we are able to collect via TechInt, via other collection avenues, human intelligence, just to sort of defend human intelligence, I would imagine quantitatively can't compare to the amount of intelligence that you're going to get from TechInt, but the quality of the information is going to be substantially better, for the most part, right? And now, I don't want to get into that debate, but the idea is, I was there with, target X, with perpetrator X. I heard him say, her say, I witnessed it myself, they told me X because they believe me,